Now, the session that we're beginning now is a very interesting one, because one of the things that happens at the World Conservation Congress is that a number of decisions are taken by the governments, by the international NGOs, the national NGOs, and for the first time, full members of IUCN, Indigenous peoples organizations. They will be adopting new proposals for developing new instruments for environmental law, new policies and philosophies. Some of them you heard about already from the ethics specialist group at the first session, where they contest the changes that were made. Some of them, as you heard, with the rights of peasants and food sovereignty, will debate the changes there. And those changes are similar to ones which Michael Wilson will describe. He is speaking, and I hope we will have a Zoom with him, on behalf of our drowning voices, young people from throughout the South Pacific whose homelands are literally disappearing and changing because of sea level rise and the impacts of climate change. So, Justice Wilson, we're honored to have you with us, and the floor is yours. Wherever you wish, they have slides for you. Just ask them to put them up.
Well, aloha, everybody. Aloha from Hawaii. That's what, as you probably know, we say. It recognizes the beauty in the human spirit, a little bit like namaste in India. I generally try to not speak longer than I'm supposed to, because I usually do. So I'm going to make sure I get started here and be organized, because I have about 10 minutes. So I am going to speak about something that has a certain amount of gravity to it, especially after the presentation that was given by Professor Voigt. We've had conferences that have involved the Global Judicial Institute and the environment, and as we have Justice Benjamin here, it generally makes me feel uncomfortable when he's in the audience, because he's articulate and points out the mistakes that I make. But when we have gathered over the years on issues of environmental law, and when we have spoken, I guess, amongst ourselves in our courts, it's become clear, and I quote Justice Benjamin, that the most important issue facing the judges of the world is climate change. And I know I'm speaking to the converted about that. So something extraordinary has happened, and it's been quite an adventure that has involved now a group of young people that have arrived here in Marseille that are working very hard on Motion 003 to create a climate crisis commission. So if you consider yourself for a moment in a position to exercise the environmental rule of law on this issue, and you're on the Supreme Court of Bangladesh, it's a bit problematic, right? Because Bangladesh has to be evacuated in about 40 years. That would mean almost 160 million people have to leave. Or if you were a judge in the court of Thailand, and just recently we did have a conference that was developed by the Asian Development Bank that had to do with important issues of trafficking that are also affected by climate change. There was a discussion about how the major food producing area of the world, that is the area that produces rice around the Mekong Delta, will be dead around the time that the 160 million people leave because of sea level rise of Bangladesh. Well, in Hawaii, we're part of the Drowning Society. That's part of what Professor Robinson was referring to. In the North and South Pacific, of course, you know that Tuvalu and Kiribati, and we're losing our major city, Honolulu. There is a moment coming, I guess you could call it the moment that's being predicted of collapse, maybe 40 or 50 years, when the operative ecosystems that maintain our economic health are no longer going to be operative. And as Supreme Court Justice Francois Conque from the Supreme Court of New South Wales has said, around that time, the rule of law is likely to diminish or disintegrate to the point where it won't make that much difference in terms of meaningful political decision-making as opposed to other forms of decision-making. It'll be much more power-centered. So as Professor Voigt was saying, we're facing a big global problem. Judges have to face a global problem. What do? There is this birth of wonderful environmental rule of law around the world, thanks to ISIL, thanks to the, I guess you could say, the intellectual legal framework of environmental law professors that have developed the precautionary principle and have developed a proposition that polluters pay, and have really been focused to some extent on the viability of bringing climate cases. Now, of course, the United States is something of a renegade in terms of environmental law that applies to climate. Thank you. I have 4 minutes. And that brings me to the situation that we have now with young people who are the future generations and also Indigenous people. They have gotten together to produce this motion to create a climate crisis commission with this unique institution. And thanks to many of you as well, who have helped us have given us advice, like Professor Robinson, and I was speaking the other evening and have had the leadership as well as Victor Taffour. Anyways, this commission would bring the power of IUCN, which is relatively unique with over 1,000 NGOs, together with the nations to focus on a climate protection plan and move forward so that at a broad level, we can actually try to keep the Earth from heating up to 1.5 degrees. So an interesting resistance formed that I guess your series of motions has also been the victim of. We managed to make it through the protocol for IUCN to create a climate crisis commission motion, and it was proposed for the members to vote on. And then a somewhat undefined group called the Working Motions Group took our motion and turned it into a motion to create a task force, which was quite a statement to the young people that have been working for a year for free, working very hard to bring this to the attention of the members so they could vote on having a climate crisis commission. Now we're doing our best. We're going to have a contact group that will meet tomorrow. We're doing our best to be able to get before the members this motion to create a climate crisis commission. And I am hopeful that this will be a defining moment in IUCN in which this idea of focusing resources to protect the planet and future generations and Indigenous people will take precedence over whatever procedural agenda was behind taking the motion and defeating it before we even have the vote, because the motion was to create a climate crisis commission, and that's turned into now a motion. It's been amended to create a task force. So I'll thank all of you for the support that I know many of you have already said that you're giving. If you could let other people know, we want to make sure and pass the Climate Crisis Commission. And when we do have the contact group tomorrow, we're very hopeful that we'll be able to move ahead in a way that has been discussed by Professor Voigt about being global, giving a chance for a grassroots effort, and being able to utilize the enormous expertise of the scientists of IUCN and the lawyers who are represented here today in the World Commission on Environmental Law. So we'd have a climate protection plan with elements that would mean we're going to keep the Earth from heating up to 1.5 degrees. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to ISIL. I've heard so much about ISIL. I haven't had the privilege in the past of attending any of your proceedings, but I'm really grateful to have been here. So thank you very much, Professor Robinson. Thank you very much,
Justice Wilson. The contact group for his motion will be at 12:45 if you wish to go online tomorrow. Our second motion that is being debated is a new and urgent motion. It doesn't have a number yet, and I understand that not only ISIL and the Center for Environmental Legal Studies, but also the French National Committee for IUCN will be submitting motions on zoonosis and our global pandemic. We're honored to have with us Professor Elisa Scotti by way of Zoom. And she has been the leader of the Global Pandemic Network, a new effort to bring together scholars from all around the world to work on all aspects of the pandemic. So Elisa, if I can invite you to speak to the conference. We have about 50 people here in Marseille, spatially distanced, and we have several hundred people online through the internet. So we welcome you from Rome or from Italy for our conference, please.
Thank you. And first of all, let me start by thanking Professor Nicholas Robinson and all the organizers for inviting me to be part of this outstanding event. As Professor Robinson said, I'm from the Global Pandemic Network, a newly established international network in the social sciences, founded by a group of scholars from different universities around the world with the aim of bringing together and exchanges research and information on pandemics. More specifically, our aim is to discuss model of institutional, economic, environmental, and social resilience. Why do we focus on resilience? Sorry, I can, yes, I am on the fourth slide. I'm not sure it is the correct slide. So why do we focus on resilience? We have three main reasons. The first is because resilience is dominant in post-pandemic public and private strategies. Arguably, in a era of ever-increasing crisis, it is likely to overcome or incorporate sustainability. The current adjective in public and private strategies is resilience. And it might be good news if resilience were rooted in ecology with a holistic approach, following the effort of influential scholars such as Nicholas Robinson to design an ecological legal principles of resilience. But, and this is, next slide, please. It is the second reason for our focus. In widespread common usage, the concept is unclear and now refers not only to ecological resilience, but also to institutional resilience, health resilience, resilience of market and economic system, resilience of supply chains, and so on. And resilience is understood primarily and generically as the capacity of system to manage, adapt, and or recover rapidly from a potential disruptive event or crisis. Next slide, please. Thus, resilience as a guiding objective for pandemic and post-pandemic policies and strategies can be misunderstood and lead to risks. What is the prevailing resilience? Is there a hierarchy of interests when different fields conflict? How to interface the different sectoral approach and reconcile it with an ecological approach? These risks and questions are the third reason for our attention. Next slide, please. These risks and questions are particularly relevant today as the construction of a post-pandemic resilient society leads to changes in economy, social, and institutional paradigms to ensure greater resilience to future crises of various kinds, also environmental crises. And these changes, as well as affecting private investors, will be supported technically and financially by the public sector with agency with significant recovery funds. Next slide, please. However, as the next three slides clearly show, the recovery will only be partially focused on the green transition, and in some ways, green is promoted not only because of ecological concerns, but also as a future market. Next slide, please. The next again. Okay. Could you run on the following? We have 3 graphs. I don't know why I'm not connected with the slide. It should be the slide number 8. So if you can move back to the slide number 8.
We have a very short time, so maybe.
Okay, so we know that. Let's move without the slides. We know that the green recovery is only partial, and it happened immediately, but also in the plan for post-pandemic reconstruction. This means that we need to learn more from the COVID-19 pandemic. Indeed, COVID-19 shows the link between human health, animal health, and the environment. We know that it is a zoonotic spillover that confirms that biodiversity loss is a health risk multiplier. And with the 6th mass extinction in Earth history underway, I'm quoting Professor Robinson, the next pandemic is here and we must act immediately. Related to this context is the One Health policy promoted by multilateral agencies and NGOs, including WHO, the World Organization for Animal Health, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Bank, and also the IUCN. It is built around the awareness of the links between human wildlife, domestic animals, plants, ecosystem, and all of nature. And it promotes the contribution of life sciences to manage the integrity of ecosystem and biodiversity to sustain the health and well-being of life on Earth. Therefore, the Global Pandemic Network effort to discuss the resilience models has at its core the idea of socio-ecological resilience based on holistic perspective, priority of ecological resilience as a precondition for all the other resilience. One Health approach, ecological law approach with an ethical foundation and connection with the principle of prevention, precaution, non-regression, eco-proportionality, respect for human rights and justice. In order to discuss the idea, our effort is also to try to identify possible relevant legal instruments to ensure implementation, such as a rethought of environmental impact assessment, increase the legal relevance of planet boundaries in decision-making processes, the development of indicator, and so on. And
So
to this end,
I think we're going to have to wind it up because we have 2 other programs coming. So,
okay.
But I want to thank you so much for the leadership you are giving to the Global Pandemic Network, and invite all of the people participating in this symposium to go to the Global Pandemic Network's website and see how to cooperate, because this zoonosis and future pandemics and the current pandemic affect us all. And we all have a stake in cooperating with Professor Scotti and her colleagues. So I want to thank you. I'm sorry for having to move the program forward, but it's a privilege to have you on the program. I don't know if you have the Zoom connection to Madison Schaff as the next Zoom. If we can bring up that Zoom. Then we will go to the discussion of the motion on the Declaration of Discovery. Maybe while we're working for that to come up, I can ask David Forman to introduce the issue of the Doctrine of Discovery, and we'll see if we can find the other Zoom links. No, you go first, because I don't have the Zoom links. Oh,
Hi,
here's
everyone.
Madison. Oh,
My name is Madison Schaff, and I am a student at the Elizabeth Howe School of Law. Today, I will be discussing the new energy motion called Ensuring Ambient Health averting the next pandemic. This is a new and urgent motion because the COVID-19 pandemic had not occurred at the time that we submitted our original motions. So that's why it is new. And it also is urgent because there are so many different COVID-19 similar diseases out there. And so we would like to prevent them, making it more and more urgent so that we can save more people. A little bit of background about what a zoonotic disease is that the CDC defines a zoonotic disease as a disease that is caused by germs spreading between animals and people. There are a lot of different ways to contract these types of diseases, such as directly in contact with the animal or the disease coming from an animal through saliva, blood, and things like that. It can also be through indirect contact, vector-borne contact, foodborne, and waterborne. A lot of the issues come from direct contact, which will help with why we want to prevent similar zoonotic diseases through things such as zone buffers, wildlife preserves, and things like that that we have control over to try to buffer out those areas where humans come into contact with more and more animals. Our motion discusses the true need to address the zoonotic spillover. Currently, there are 700,000 known zoonotic viruses that have the capability similar to COVID-19. This is also an environmental justice issue, as the impacts of COVID-19 were disproportionately felt among people of color and also communities that have been historically kept out of having access to resources, power, and the ability to combat such a virus. We stress that the connections between a healthy environment will be key to a successful prevention of future diseases. For this reason, we are making the motion that the IUCN should adopt the One Health policy as its universal policy. This would mean strengthening the health of the environment to, in turn, strengthen the health links that connect humans and the environment, and also the animals. In addition to the One Health policy, we hope that IUCN members will strengthen their own environmental impact assessments to make sure that buffer zones between wildlife and humans are accounted for when making environmentally impact decisions. We also ask that a task force is identified to further explore solutions that go beyond this motion. Thank you so much for your time.
Then we go. So thank you very much. That's the new and interesting motion that you should look for on zoonosis. We next go to the question of the doctrine of discovery, which is essential to the rights of Indigenous people. And we have a Zoom from Christopher Sudol in New York.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christopher Sudol. I'm a law student at Pace University at the Elizabeth Hobbs School of Law, and I, along with Professor Robinson and a bunch of my colleagues and predecessors, for a few years now have been working on Motion 48, which calls for the IUCN to renounce the Doctrine of Discovery. The Doctrine of Discovery, just to be brief background, is a legal fiction which has its origins in the 5th century AD, but is most commonly associated with the papal bulls initiated by the Pope in the 1490s to initiate exploration of Christian European empires, mainly Spain and Portugal, to areas both in Africa and the Americas. And the Doctrine of Discovery was a principle that provided Christian Europeans supremacy in both rights to land and rights to the use of land. And this has persisted not only through the era of colonization, but also in our world today, and with the adoption of this legal fiction as the underpinnings of our modern legal regime in a lot of places around the world. The Doctrine of Discovery throughout its implementation has not been unchallenged. In fact, Bartolomé de las Casas in the 16th century was outspoken about the atrocities that colonization and these principles of the Doctrine of Discovery had on Indigenous peoples, mainly through the exploitation of labor and natural resources. Today, the Doctrine of Discovery supports a lot of detrimental activities to both the rights of Indigenous peoples and nature, including biodiversity. And we are calling for the IUCN and its members to renounce the doctrine of discovery in allyship with Indigenous peoples around the world, to support the IUCN's adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and support the Indigenous rights of Indigenous peoples, as well as support the conservation efforts of the IUCN. We're also calling for IUCN members to adopt the original language of the Motion 48, which has been diluted by the review committees of the IUCN. So we're hoping to adopt the original language that explicitly calls for IUCN members to reject the doctrine of discovery explicitly. In terms of how countries around the world and legal regimes are already adopting efforts to roll back the doctrine of discovery, have been with initiatives such as co-management of national parks within the US, Australia, New Zealand, the awarding of rights of personhood to rivers such as the Waitangi River in New Zealand. However, without the explicit renunciation of the doctrine of discovery, all of these efforts are limited in their effectiveness and support of the rights of Indigenous peoples and the conservation mission of the IUCN. So thank you for allowing me to speak, and I look forward to the days to come.
Well, now I ask Professor Forman to supplement that with the further comments.
I would like to begin my very brief remarks by first expressing a deep appreciation to the Normandy Chair for Peace. My involvement with NCP has given me the privilege of working with amazing French scholars, attorneys, and others who are focusing attention on the intersection of environmental law and human rights. People who have been pushing the envelope on these vital issues. Second, I'm likewise thrilled to be building upon a productive collaboration with the wonderful faculty and students from the Elizabeth Hobbs School of Law at Pace University in New York, led by Professor Nicholas Robinson. We worked together in Marseille 5 years ago, and we are well on our way to redoubling those efforts here in Marseille. Christopher did a fantastic job of explaining the injustice represented by the doctrine of discovery, which has already been renounced by the Episcopal Church in 2009, the Anglican Church of Canada in 2010, the World Council of Churches Executive Committee in 2012, and in 2016, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in the United States, among others. Perhaps most recently, in 2021, the Evangelical Covenant Church in the United States joined a long list of Protestant denominations who have renounced the theological justifications for exercising dominion and sovereignty in the form of Christendom or empire. If my kuya, or elder brother, Tony Oposa, were here, he might regale you with stories of Chief Lapu-Lapu, who killed the would-be discoverer, Ferdinand Magellan, on Mactan Island in 1521. By chance, the same place I greeted Professor Nick Robinson on his first visit to the Philippines. Some of you may also have heard stories about the fate of Captain Cook at Kealakekua Bay on the island of Hawaii in 1779. However, I do not have sufficient time to explain how, in 1843, the Kingdom of Hawaii became the first non-European indigenous state whose independence was recognized by the major powers, except perhaps to note that promulgation of Hawaii's first constitution in 1840 was the same year that Britain negotiated the Treaty of Waitangi in New Zealand. By comparison, Australia's 1900 constitution rejected the concepts of equal protection and due process to allow continued racial discrimination against Aboriginal peoples. Christopher previously mentioned the subsequent, I believe he cut out, but he was in his recorded message, he mentioned the 1992 Mabo versus Queensland decision that helped invigorate restorative justice efforts in that jurisdiction. Beyond time limitations, I do not claim the expertise to detail the complexities across Oceania involving the doctrine of discovery. However, I hope it is not gauche for me to acknowledge the influences of early 19th century French naturalists and cartographers like Georges Cuvier, Dumont d'Urville, and Charles Monod. According to the historian, Professor Brownwen Douglas, the term Oceania was inherently racialized from the time of its invention in 1804. According to Professor Douglas, the legal fiction that Christopher described is a, quote, unthinking anachronism that was neither inevitable, as has been proclaimed by its proponents, nor should its resulting domination of nature and indigenous peoples be eternal. Thus, I hope that my fellow IUCN members will agree to adopt motion 048 in its original form by expressly renouncing the doctrine of discovery. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It sounds a little absurd to think that many nations still believe that the doctrine of discovery means that there was no one living in these places when they were colonized and, quote, discovered. Of course, the people who live there know differently, and so do their descendants. So it's time to retire this principle. The last of our topics goes back really to the topic that Michael Wilson came up with, and that is climate change and the whole issue of the IUCN program and the proposals for dealing with having IUCN decide in the program that will be adopted this coming week whether or not to renounce the use of fossil fuels. So I call upon the Zooms that we have from Professor Ottinger and John NOTORIS and Carly Hopkins, if we can have those presentations put up. They will present to you this strange situation, and that IUCN has felt that renouncing fossil fuels was not a part of its program and didn't need to be a policy guidance for IUCN. So if we can have those Zoom videos put up, please.
Hello, my name is John NOTORIS.
Hi, and I'm Carly Hopkins. John and I are both 2Ls at the Elizabeth Hobbs School of Law at Pace University.
Carly and I have been working closely with Professor Richard Ottinger on drafting an amendment to motion 034 to combat the energy crisis. Among many things, this amendment aims to add to the motion's call for a study to determine what actions IUCN should take to address the climate threats, call on IUCN members and experts to urge their governments and private sector organizations to phase out their dependence on fossil fuels and terminate their fossil fuel subsidies, calls for action to phase out plans for new plastics production installation, broaden the definition of nature-based solutions to include energy from the sun, wind, and oceans, and lastly, include these measures in the 2021-2024 IUCN program.
The following is an explanation of the reasoning behind the proposed amendment, mainly what the world is facing, why we need to act now, and the actions we need to take. So what is the world facing? Climate change effects are far more drastic and immediate than previously predicted, according to the recent IPCC findings. Intensified weather events such as deadly storms, heat waves, floods, droughts, and forest fires, resulting in thousands of deaths and destruction of communities, homes, and farmlands are now predicted as certainties.
Since the Paris Climate Accords, global temperatures have not decreased, but actually increased by 1 degree centigrade. Temperatures are continuously rising closer to the cautioned 1.5 degree centigrade increase, which has potentially devastating effects on our planet.
Additionally, biodiversity loss has been experienced on a historical level across the globe. 1 million species are at the risk of extinction, more than ever before in human history, and IPBES finds that climate change is a major factor in this looming catastrophe.
So why act now? Immediate steps in mitigating and adapting climate change must be taken, as there is no longer time to only develop in the future a plan for addressing its existential threats. If prompt and drastic steps are not taken, all the good work that IUCN has done to preserve biodiversity will be nullified regardless of the actions taken at the World Conservation Congress regarding climate change.
So what actions do we need to take? We propose to broaden the IUCN definition of nature-based solutions to include renewable energy practices, such as solar, wind, and hydroelectricity, all practices which are recognized as essential elements of reduction of the climate crisis threat. Nature-based solutions are solutions that utilize the power of functioning ecosystems as infrastructure to provide natural services to benefit society and the environment. Examples of nature-based solutions include ecological restoration, ecosystem-based adaptation, green infrastructure, and much more. The IUCN currently excludes energy from the sun, wind, and oceans from its definition of nature-based solutions. Additionally, it does not include the phase-out of fossil fuels as a nature-based solution.
In addition, our amendment to motion 034 calls on IUCN's thousands of members and experts to urge their governments and private sector organizations to phase out their dependence on fossil fuels that are responsible for more than 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, the prime cause of climate change, and also eliminate their fossil fuel subsidies. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, part of my pronunciation, calls for strong commitment from all governments to end fossil fuel subsidies, among other things, and outlined the need for an annual 6% decrease in energy production from fossil fuels through renewables, transition programs, economic diversification plans, green bonds, and other instruments to advance sustainability. Furthermore, Secretary General Guterres states that global emissions need to fall by 7.6% every year between now and 2030 to limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels.
We call on members and experts to urge their governments to phase out the non-essential uses of plastic, oppose the proposed construction of many planned new plastic production facilities, recognize the studies which find that plastic production and disposal are not just major pollutants of the oceans, but are also major contributors to the climate crisis that the proposed additions alone would prevent achieving the prescribed 1.5 degrees limitation of global temperature. We also invite proposals for additional immediate actions that members and experts may take for mitigation and adaptation of the climate crisis. For the foregoing reasons, motion 034 should be amended to reflect the current urgency of the climate crisis and take stronger stances on concrete actions to curb the drastic effects of climate change. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
So motion 034 will be up for contact group negotiations. Professor Richard Ottinger is with us. He is the originator of this proposal. It's been now debated in IUCN without results for about 4 years. Professor Ottinger.
I think I'm very proud of our students' presentation. And I think nobody could have said it better than Christina Voigt when she emphasized the urgency of taking action now. The motion 034 purports to present the entire program for the next 3 years of IUCN on climate change and biodiversity. But it sticks just incredibly to the fine work that IUCN does on biodiversity and the preservation of forests and the preservation of oceans. I don't diminish that for a bit. It's very important. But it represents only 1/3 of the solution to the problems that we're experiencing. And indeed, in our own area, we have just felt with the results of Hurricane Ida. So I do hope that the IUCN will take seriously at its Congress this time the need to act now and not just create a committee to consider what actions should be taken in the future. And we've presented 3 specific measures that could be taken now, and we would welcome other ideas. And also, I think that motion 003, the creation of a climate commission within IUCN, focusing attention on those measures beyond which IUCN does so well now, is really very important. And I hope that you will support that motion as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ottinger. I think we've had a tremendous emphasis at this symposium on intergenerational equity. Richard Ottinger has campaigned on energy reform for nearly 50 years or more. He's 92 years old, so I think we're getting one vision from the past.